Excellent. I'm Trevor Morris, and I'm the Dean of the Law School here. This is one of those evenings when I am especially honored to say that. I do have the great honor of welcoming all of you to the inaugural conversation of our new Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. We are delighted to welcome We are truly delighted and honored to welcome our distinguished guests, the Honorable Loretta Lynch, the 83rd Attorney General of the United States. NYU Law's own Sherrilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And of course, the incomparable Professor Bryan Stevenson of this faculty. Thank you to all three of you for being part of tonight's event, and thank you especially to Professor Tony Thompson, the faculty director of this new center. One often hears the phrase, no more important time than now, never a better time than now. I'm going to use it again here, and I hope you'll agree with me that there's never been a place where it's more appropriate to say that there's never been a more important time than now to launch a center such as this. The launch of this center comes at a time of increased national dialogue and justified increased national concern about issues implicating race and inequality in our criminal justice system, in our legal system more broadly, in our society. None of these issues are new, but all of them have a renewed urgency today. And the law school is deeply proud to be continuing the leadership position that we have staked out through our faculty, through our students, through our distinguished graduates on these issues for many years. And tonight we announce our institutional commitment to continue to lead, to continue to work hard, to seek solutions that will not be easy to find and will be even more difficult to implement. But there is no choice but to press forward, and so we do. This center will serve as a hub for students and scholars and community members to exchange ideas on race, ethnicity, and inequality in all of its dimensions. We'll achieve this through convening conversations of this sort and others, lectures and symposia, by working on policy projects with partner organizations outside the law school, and by preparing our students who work together with faculty on this center themselves to be leaders in the law and working on issues of race and inequality in the law in the years and decades to come. We are very proud that the center will be the new home to the long-standing Derrick Bell Lecture on Race in American Society. You all know that the Bell Lecture is really a flagship event at the law school every year that brings leading thinkers to share their work on racial justice and civil rights. Sherrilyn Ifill delivered the 20th annual Bell Lecture in 2015, and we look forward to continued wonderful speakers each year in that. We are very grateful that we have here with us tonight Dr. Janet Dewart-Bell herself, really an inspiration, in fact, the person who thought up the Bell Lecture. Thank you, Janet, for being with us. I do want to reiterate the importance of this center to the strategic mission of the entire law school. We have, in announcing a strategic plan this past year, identified issues around diversity and inclusion as ones of deep strategic significance for the school. We hope to make progress on those issues within our own community and also to be a thought leader on these vital issues in the law and society more broadly. We were thrilled last semester to launch the new Center on Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, led by our own Professor Kenji Yoshino. The launch event of that center, of course, was here in this room in a conversation with Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And we think the launch tonight of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law perfectly complements what we've already set out to do in this area, and we are just thrilled by the synergies that the launch of these two centers provides, and we look forward to both of their exciting work going forward. I am indeed very personally grateful to Tony Thompson for taking on the leadership of this center. Tony is a spectacular colleague to all of us on the faculty, a wonderfully accomplished teacher and mentor to hundreds, indeed probably thousands of students at this point. There is no better person to lead this center, and so without further ado, please join me in welcoming and thanking Tony Thompson.
So we face this painful reality that we're headed down this perilous path. The toxic rhetoric over the last year has surfaced attitudes that we thought were confined to our history. We're experiencing a steady and dangerous marginalization of immigrants, people of color, and the poor. We're witnessing an uptick in hate crimes and hate speech. We're seeing government officials issuing policies propelled by the twin forces of arrogance and ignorance. And we in this room simply can't stand still and hope things will go well. We must take action individually and collectively to change the entire discussion of a nation. So we're here to redirect a base and insensitive and destructive public conversation. We're here to reorient a country that seems to have lost its way. To paraphrase Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, we're here because injustice is here. We have work to do. So, good evening. My name's Tony Thompson. And I want to welcome all of you to the launch of this center. It's so exciting for all of us. You should know tonight that we've had to spill into not one but two other rooms. Our RSVPs for this event were over 1,200. I regret because of that we won't be able to have an after reception. Our rooms are full. But it's time for people of good conscience to come together, and I'm excited for the people that are here. And we have three of the best warriors for justice in the country to talk to you tonight about our future. But before we get to the program, there's a couple things I need to do. First, I need to thank some people. I want to thank Trevor. Trevor has been a great partner and ally in this formation of this center. He's had a vision, and we've worked together as partners to bring it to fruition. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank President Andy Hamilton, who's here. His participation in tonight's event, his participation in tonight's event is important, but also, and more importantly to me, his actions in the last year have made me quite proud of this institution. It's also brought us the fact that we have our own Hamilton. While there are too many people here at the law school to thank for making this evening happen, I do want to call attention to my team. Vincent Sutherland, who actually used to work for Sarah. Penelope Fernandez, Leslie Hart, Denisha Edwards, and David Niedenthal all made tonight happen, and I want to thank them. I also want to thank the many alums who have sent emails and the dozens who have called me. And don't worry, I plan to get back to each of you individually to solicit financial support for the center. Many of the events of the last year have shaken us, but to a certain extent they were inevitable. We were not as vigilant as we should have been, and we became a little complacent in the last 8 years. Recent events have reminded us that we need to again regain our vigilance, and we must take on the challenge of justice at every turn. Many of you in this room are in your 20s and early 30s. You've only known 8 years of an administration that embraced many of our values and reflected our diversity and advanced our ideals. So the tone and the conduct of this new administration is jarring. But while this administration seems intent on writing you off, you should know that the center intends to write you back in. We have work to do. The Center on Race, Inequality, and Law intends to be a place where we will engage in that important work. The center intends to play a role in the important conversation taking place for the heart and soul of America. We expect to contribute as partners in the ongoing struggle for human rights and social justice, and we mean taking the country to task where it must be taken to task. We know that injustice and inequality often tracks along racial lines. Racism is embedded in the DNA of America. But while people of color have disproportionately felt its effects, it's an American problem, In fact, it is the American problem, and it will require a collective strategy involving all Americans. Let me take a moment to highlight one place where we will focus our initial efforts. As we witness the early decisions coming from this White House and this Congress, it has become apparent that the work on social justice will need to take place on two main fronts. The first being at the federal level, because we can't write off the federal government. The second will be at a local level, where we need to hold the line on progress and look for ways to make gains. I want to talk for a minute about the local level. We're already witnessing progressive cities and states carving out spaces separate from the federal government. We have cities reaffirming their commitment to being sanctuary cities and developing policies to direct local officials to defy ill-conceived, irrational, and unjust immigration holes. But that's just the beginning. Cities and states will have to become incubators for innovation. Local governments will have to develop novel approaches to reimagine and rebuild our democracy from the ground up. This means that cities will need to find innovative ways to include rather than exclude voices of the people who are affected by their policies. Cities and states will need to develop new ways to build healthy communities. These efforts will include new approaches to developing affordable housing, to placing critical mental and health care needs in the neighborhoods where they're needed, and the investment of resources connecting communities with infrastructure that continue to experience the effects of hypersegregation. We also will need to look to help communities continue their important work in the oversight of our police departments. We are already hearing a narrative of fear and misdirection, claims that crime is out of control, a narrative that justifies a path to a certain kind of law and order. Notwithstanding that crime rates are down in the country, they're looking to resurrect stop and frisk and return to policies we have not seen since the war on drugs. We must resist that. We are seeing executive orders that, both in their tone and their optics, suggest that communities are to blame for the dire state of police-community relations. And we're seeing calls for reduced regulation and oversight of law enforcement. For my students in the room, the challenge of your generation has never been so clear. You've got to draw a line in the sand around inclusion, equity, and justice. We have work to do. Finally, the work of the center is personal for me. As the son of a Central American immigrant, I'm personally offended by a government that looks to exacerbate divisions rather than nurture and build our rich diversity. But being offended is not enough. I learned that early in my career. I learned it from two individuals on whose shoulders I stand, Professor Charles Ogletree and Professor Derek Bell. Charles Ogletree was recently honored by the NAACP Image Awards for his lifetime commitment to justice. He taught me how to be a fierce advocate for clients. He showed me how to speak truth to power when he represented Anita Hill in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. And he found ways to fight for justice. And then there's Derek Bell, another mentor and a friend. He helped fight many of the critical battles while he was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He also made a personal battle and waged war on the lack of diversity on law school faculties. I never imagined one day he would be my friend and my colleague. It is with great honor I announce tonight at the launch of the center that New York University School of Law has commissioned a portrait of Professor Derek Bell. That portrait will be unveiled at a ceremony in the fall, and we're looking forward to having all of you there. The center's agenda is unapologetically ambitious. We intend to host and lead the conversations about race and social justice going into the 21st century. And tonight, to launch our effort, I have asked three people who I count as close friends to join us to help us think about the future of race and inequality in America. Please join me in welcoming the president of the nation's most important civil rights organization and an NYU alum, Sherrilyn Ifill. My friend, my colleague, and my brother, the person Desmond Tutu called America's Mandela, Bryan Stevenson. And someone who's had the most important voice, the single most important voice in the nation's government for those without a voice, the first woman of color in history to serve in the role, the 83rd Attorney General of the United States, my friend Loretta Lynch. So let me begin by saying each of these folks could give a speech on this issue on their own. But both with the methodology of the center and our practice, we've decided that we're going to try to engage in conversations. So I've asked my panelists to engage in a conversation. I told them that you need not to be called on. You can jump in at any point, even if somebody's already talking. There's no reason to act any differently just because we're in the front of the room. So let's get started. I wanted to not focus too much on the administration, but so much is happening daily. I have to ask you, Sherilyn, let me begin with you. When we think about issues of race and inequality, what are your concerns when you see a cabinet that doesn't reflect our rich diversity and the unpredictability in the White House these days?
So first of all, thank you for having me as part of this terrific event. I'm so happy for you, Tony Thompson, but also for NYU, that you are launching this center. It's so important that you take in your hands really the principal issue of democracy of our day, and that you embed it deeply in this extraordinary institution. I'm always proud to say I'm an NYU alum. I'm not one of the people who did not enjoy law school. I had a ball. And in large part, it's because NYU spoke directly to the reason that I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer from the time I was 8 years old. It was a culture that recognized the importance, the power, the nobility of being a civil rights lawyer, and nurtured that. So I'm always happy to be home, and of course I thank Dean Morrison for having me back, and I bow before Jewel, as everyone does, Bell, and Janet Dewart-Bell, I'm sorry, and I'm so happy to hear that the Derrick Bell Lecture will be housed in this center. It was my honor and privilege to give the lecture several years ago, so thank you. So this is a tough day to ask me that question, because just a few hours before I arrived, when our Associate Director Counsel, Janae Nelson, was on her way to Texas to argue part of our challenge to Texas's voter ID law. And as you probably know, Texas's voter ID law is the most stringent voter ID law in the country. It was enacted after the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby case. This is the law that prevents our client, a university student, from using her university ID to vote, prevents Native Americans from using their tribal ID to vote, prevents the use of all kinds of employee IDs that had been utilized in the past, does allow you to use a concealed gun carry permit, and you just have to love Texas, and has the effect of disenfranchising 600,000 eligible voters. And the Department of Justice, under Attorney General Lynch, and before that under Attorney General Holder, were co-counsel with us on that case. We challenged both the effect under the Voting Rights Act of that law, and we challenged the intentional discrimination that we believed formed the basis of this law. And we won that case in 3 different courts on this question of whether it violates the Voting Rights Act because it has discriminatory effects, and we were sent back down to the district court to look at intentional discrimination. Anyway, so we're supposed to argue that case tomorrow morning, and we are arguing that case tomorrow morning, but just a few hours before I came, we received word from the new and not improved Justice Department that they will no longer pursue and prosecute the intentional discrimination portion of the case. So this is not a surprise. We know who Jeff Sessions is, and we certainly, the Legal Defense Fund, have known him for a very long time. It was our clients that he prosecuted in 1985 for voter fraud in Perry County, Alabama. So we've known him for a long time, and so this is what you kind of expect. And yet, nevertheless, it kind of does take your breath away, I have to say. And I would have to say, in answer to the very specific question that you asked when you talked about a cabinet that doesn't look like, us and doesn't look like America, I'm just happy about that, because I actually was encouraged by the difficulty that this president seemed to have in finding qualified people to serve. Not interested in diversity for this cabinet, to be perfectly honest, given the positions that it was clear this president was going to take. So we're just at a very important flex moment for this country, maybe a moment like no other. I mean, I've talked to a million people who've said we've been through this before, we'd do it again, and we've been through a lot of it before, but I'm not sure it's been quite like this in terms of who's in the White House and the what I would call kind of the velvet rope has been removed from the shame, what used to be the shame of being racist. of being misogynistic, of even if you had those feelings, you just try to cover it. Now it's kind of out there, and so I think that's something very difficult to grapple with, the normalization of things that had been forbidden, and that's the world that many of these students will inherit.
So, Loretta, let me ask you, you were able to elevate issues of race and equal justice while you ran the Justice Department. It not only became part of the national dialogue, but it became part of the Justice Department's policy and policy agenda. What are your concerns when you look at the role of government in these conversations about race going forward?
I think that the example that Sherilyn just gave, I think, really encapsulates the current situation and the challenge going forward. Because, you know, we're definitely in challenging times. We're definitely in difficult times. A lot of things that so many of us fought for are being deliberately and actively rolled back, pushed back, trampled on. But what you're really seeing, which we have not seen in 50 years, is the peeling away of the role of government, away from protecting the disenfranchised, away from speaking to those who don't have a voice, away from lifting up people who've been pushed down, to being a participant in that. And that's something that this generation has not seen. You know, many of us haven't seen it in our remembered lifetime. Our parents remember it. They remember it very, very well. I mean, I think that's why this center, I think, is so aptly and accurately named when you talk about race, inequality, and the law, because there have been, sadly, periods in American life and American legal history when the law has been used to hold people down, to discriminate, and to harm our citizens. And so we thought we had moved away from that because we had people who were using the law in a certain way. And the lesson is that, you know, how the law is managed depends very, very much on whose hands it's in. And so when we have a situation where, you know, the Department of Justice steps away from one of the clearest examples of intentional discrimination from the evidence that was adduced in that case, and this is in the record, this is public. These are statements about not wanting certain types of people or certain political views to vote, the antithesis of America, I would say. So then you see who's left here. And I think we're at a point where the importance of organizations like LDF are highlighted like never before. I mean, essentially, LDF has always been there holding the federal government's feet to the fire, but you ultimately did gain a partner. Now that that partner has stepped away, you know, you will be in the forefront of this argument tomorrow and in these strategy sessions going forward. We also see the importance of centers like this, where you can have policy discussions from people from all walks of life, all generations, about how to craft policy. And I do think the local level is key here. The importance of the individual voice cannot be overstated. The only way we were able to get achievements in the first place were individuals came together and stood up and spoke out at a time when they thought they could never win. The plaintiffs in Brown never thought they were going to win that case. And that's just the reality of it. And things came together in a way that allowed them to do so, and we've built on that. Now all of that is being unraveled. Well, we still have those same people who are going to be undergoing those same deprivations of law, of liberty, of rights. And it's going to be individuals feeding into the groups that have always been the bulwark that I think are going to have to be the engines of change and thought in these issues and in these areas.
Brian, let me ask you, with the exception of the federal courts, the branches of the federal government, many state governments, are largely in the hands of those ideologically aligned with the administration. Given that, in what specific areas can those who are concerned about racial justice and equality look to gain ground over the coming years?
Well, I also have to say, just as a preliminary, thank you for making me a part of this conversation. And I cannot tell you out there how proud I am to be sitting in between two of my heroes. This is Loretta Lynch and Sherilyn Iker. Seriously. I just cannot express how proud I am to be on this stage. Tony and Loretta and I were in law school together. And to see the amazing accomplishments that she has made and the example she has set for not just women of color, but all kinds of young lawyers about attaining goals is incredibly moving to me. And I can't tell you how proud we are of you and for what you've done. I can't thank you enough for the service you've provided.
glad to be sitting next to someone who's having a movie made about their life.
I stay hopeful about what we're facing because of Sherlyn Ifill, because she is brilliant, she is hardworking, she is dedicated, and I feel like as long as she's alive and active, we've got some hope, and it's always a pleasure to be with her. And then, of course, Tony and I go way, way back. I think we're going to have to focus on some things that we've not focused on. And I think it's partly looking at what federal government can do, it's also looking at what local governments can do, but I think we have to transcend even those institutional frames. For me, the challenge that we face is a narrative battle. You see, I don't think we've actually done very effective narrative work in this country. We had a genocide in America, and when white settlers came to this continent, they killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, and we forced those people from their lands. We kept their names, and we named streets and buildings and counties and things after them. But we forced them off, and because of a narrative shift, we didn't say that's a genocide. We said those people are savages. And that narrative failure to own up and acknowledge their humanity allowed us to think that we hadn't done anything immoral, but we did. And then we had the slavery and the Civil War, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They were able to persuade the United States Supreme Court that that racial equality thing wasn't necessary. And they actually reclaimed that racial hierarchy, that ideology of white supremacy, and we allowed that to happen for 100 years. Then we had horrific terrorism and violence, and we ended the kind of mass lynchings with impunity, but those who had perpetrated that terrorism and violence won the narrative war. They were never held accountable. And then we got into the Civil Rights era, where there was this massive, incredible movement led by extraordinary people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks. And we won passage of the Voting Rights Act. We won passage of the Civil Rights Act. But we lost the narrative war. The people that were holding the signs that said segregation forever, segregation or war, were never forced to put down those signs. They didn't wave them around anymore, but they kept adhering to that value. And now we're living at a time where that narrative, that thriving narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white preference, has exhibited itself, has manifested itself, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that. And we won an election in 2008, but we lost the narrative battle. We actually allowed that president to be demonized and victimized and marginalized because he's black, not because of anything he said or anything he did. And our comfort with that kind of demonization is, I think, at the heart of the challenge that we face. And so I want us to be engaged in legal battles in court. I want us to be thinking strategically, politically about how we reclaim federal government and make local government work for us. But we've got to start fighting a narrative battle. We've got to create a country and a culture where you are not allowed to say, I'm going to ban people because they're Muslims and win with that. You're not allowed to ban people. And there will always be people who try to exploit the fear and anger that gives rise to these kinds of narratives of racial difference. And I think we haven't done a very good job. Too many of us have kind of taken advantage of the legal battles while leaving behind the narrative battle. And that, for me, is the great challenge that we face.
Can I ask a question? I mean, because this is, I think you could not be more on point. And what I think worries me is how relentless the narrative battle has to be, right? Because, I mean, the only place where I would disagree with you is I think actually, out of the civil rights movement, we won the narrative battle-ish. And by that I mean two things. I mean, one, there were a lot of compromises on the narrative, so that you can compromise the narrative, right? You know, it's all about, you had to be peaceful and love and content of the character, you know, and all the, I have a dream, right? That, you know, so it got distorted, right? So that's number one. Number two, you never really win the narrative. You have to keep it up. And I can remember when I first came to the Legal Defense Fund in 1988, Julius Chambers was the director counsel, and I was litigating voting rights cases, and I was getting ready to file a case in Oklahoma and had my little press release. And I remember Julius saying, you know, noble, brilliant civil rights lawyer who I just, you know, revered, we do our talking in the courtroom. You know, which is kind of a nice thing to say, but actually, that was precisely the moment when the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute they were forming their centers, you know? No, seriously.
Right.
And they were creating a narrative and a story. And I can remember when I started teaching constitutional law, you know, you get your case books and so forth, and you know, back in the 80s, to use the words reverse discrimination to describe affirmative action was like a slur. You couldn't call affirmative action reverse discrimination. By the time I was in my 7th year of teaching, the Rotunda casebook, some of you may use it, the whole section on affirmative action is called reverse discrimination, right? So they had taken over the language because we hadn't tended to it, is what I was trying to get to, is that there was a way in which we won some of the narrative, and then, as you said, we kind of left it alone. And so you have to kind of keep at it. There's no like permanent win,
That's
you know?
right. I think if you don't hold people accountable for the narrative
That's right.
assaults that they made,
That's right.
then you're never going to prevail.
That's right.
Because the South never voted for the Voting Rights Act. They never voted for the Civil Rights Act. They regrouped, started organizing in precisely the way you are describing, and then 48 years later, they won a Supreme Court case, Shelby County, because their narrative had persuaded the United States Supreme Court that we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore, at a time when we still saw that stuff. And so I agree with you. I do think that we have seen it, so I look at domestic violence. When we were young, y'all may remember this, you don't have to admit to it if you don't want to, but when we were young, there was a show on TV called The Honeymooners.
Yes.
You remember that?
I'm to the moon, yeah.
And the punchline was Jackie Gleason saying to his wife, to the moon, which was a threat of violence, and everybody laughed. And we didn't take domestic violence seriously. When women called the police to their homes after being assaulted, the cops would tell jokes to the guy just to get him calm. As long as he was calm, they would leave. They wouldn't make arrests. And then we began to work on a narrative. We actually allowed women who were survivors of that violence to get voices. They made the movie, The Burning Bed. And we started talking about the pain and the injury and the suffering. And before you know it, we started to think differently about that. And today, even these elite athletes, these professional athletes, are risking something, not nearly enough. We still have a long way to go when they engage in these acts of violence. I think climate change, we've seen the same thing. But we haven't made that kind of effort, in my view, where we're directing things at the communities that need a narrative shift. And I think until we do that, we're not going to make the progress. Because at least I live in Alabama. To me, Alabama doesn't look a lot different than it would have looked 80 years ago from the landscape level. If you are celebrating Jefferson Davis's birthday as a state holiday, if Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday, if you don't have Martin Luther King Day, but it's Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day, there is a narrative problem in your state, right? And we have our two largest high schools, Robert E. Lee High, Jefferson Davis High, they're both 99% black, and nobody's saying anything about that. And that's where I believe we've got to begin to re-engage in a conversation that doesn't give away the power of the history. That is why we are all up here talking about race.
Right, right.
So let me ask you, if we don't tether that conversation to court cases, but how do we make it part of the national discourse, part of the national dialogue?
Well, I think it can start with court cases in terms of the reactions to the court cases that we are seeing. You know, I think some of the biggest disappointments for me have been this administration's change in how they're dealing with transgender issues and those issues. But those issues are very personal issues also. And I agree with you, with both of you, on the importance and the power of the narrative. And I think when you shift away from this concept of taking away entitlement from one group and giving it to another, and focus on the pain that groups feel, groups that are actually all alike feel, you can start to shift that narrative. And that's what we started to do with our focus on transgender and LGBT rights, is focusing on the commonality of the pain there. And why, for me, it was such an important civil right, because it's the same. You know, we're all different, and so we can all suffer in similar ways. And so I think when it comes to racial issues also, you're right, the narrative has been hijacked. It's become one of a limited slice of equality being taken from one group to the benefit of another who has not worked for it. But that narrative is as old as the hills. And so I think when we look, though, at how narratives are successfully changed, you come at them from another way. You know, one of the ways in which you're often able to get success is not by talking about, frankly, what's right or what's moral, but the cost of something. I mean, the cost of racism in this society to everyone, the literal dollar cost of racism to GDP is huge. It's tremendous. And so one way to engage on those issues, I think, is to expand the discussion beyond the sort of the whole moral issues, which you have a group of people who at this point are probably not going to change their minds on that. And look at how these issues harm this country. You know, we're losing people. People disappear. We're losing the benefit of people who can contribute to society. That's dollars and cents. And that actually has been the way that we've been able to cross over and bring certain groups into discussions like criminal justice reform that you never thought you were going to get into those groups. What will happen with that, I don't know either. But I think expanding the narrative also beyond what people expect to hear, but focusing on the commonality of the pain it's causing all of us is a way to start.
See, one of the things that worries me about, it actually goes to Derek Bell and interest convergence, right, is that when we say, when we assign the dollar value to it, when we say, we should behave in certain ways because this is what it costs us, I think it's an essential part of the conversation, but I worry that it covers over some of the truth-telling that is part of the narrative that Brian is talking about, because it makes our pursuit of justice and equality about pragmatism and not about moral rights or wrongs or any of the, or justice or the rule of law or the things that I think have the real staying power, because people are remaking calculations all the time. On the other hand, I do agree with you that dealing with the economics of it is something that we have also failed to do, and
Yes.
frankly, it's part of the narrative.
Yes.
So the conversation that next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and so we're planning all these things around housing, and it's housing discrimination and housing segregation is a huge part of what kind of constrains economic mobility and opportunity in this country. And like with lynching, for me, walking out into the landscape of America, because I love history so much, is really about understanding the ways in which America has invested in creating what we see today.
Yes.
And I say this to people all the time: we accept the physical landscape as though it is inevitable and not as though it were created by a series of decisions and investments. Yeah. And unpeeling that narrative of equality and investments, I think, is really important. When people say to me, my family never had slaves, we were always nice people, we're not implicated in any of this, I just find it to be really astonishing. I mean, here we are all in the same country. You move into a neighborhood, you turn on the water comes out of the pipe. Your grandparents didn't make the pipes in that city, but you accept the water that comes out of the pipe. I mean, there are all these ways in which we accept the advantages of wherever we are, right? You come to this country. Your parents or your grandparents are immigrants. We all still have a cookout on Memorial Day, even though your parents and grandparents didn't serve in World War II. We do all these things. We take all the benefits, all the good memories, all the things that make us great. You do your President's Day shopping. But when it comes to the other part of the history, that also is part of our history that we have to take responsibility for, whether it's lynching or whether it's the fact that part of the reason that you were able to live the life, or your parents to live the life that they live, is because this country decided after World War II to make a massive investment in creating the white middle class, that they did it through the GI Bill, that it was billions of dollars of the interstate highway that allowed suburbs to be made to create this world that we think, is some time we want to make America great about again. It's like Wall-E and the Beaver and all that stuff. And all of that was created by massive investments, things that were not available for black people because it was not to create the black suburbs. And if you had the GI Bill, you couldn't move into any neighborhood.
Right.
You couldn't buy a house in any neighborhood. And the FHA, once they started insuring mortgages in the 1930s, created redlining and would not allow integrated neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And these were all government programs.
And these were all government programs. So to the
programs.
extent you're hearkening your mind back to some lovelier time, to understand that that time was constructed. Now, here's the thing. I'm not even saying, let's deconstruct it. I'm saying we have the power with investments to make the society we want to make. In the 1950s, we decided to make it, and we made it. We made something that everybody recognizes: the winding road, the cul-de-sac, the interstate highway, the Levitowns that wouldn't have let black people live there but got all the tax development breaks and so forth. Let's suppose we took a different tack today. Let's suppose we wanted to create a society in which we limited the disparities in equality, in which people had access to housing, in which people had access to homes, in which there was rapid public transportation outside of New York City and other big cities. We could do it the same way we did what we did in the 1950s. So my piece is to get people to understand that it's not just about feelings, that it's about investments, that investments follow your direction as
Right.
a
And those are the
society.
choices that we make.
That's right. That's right.
It's also part of the, how do we get it as part of the national discourse? You know, Brian, your TED Talk's been viewed 5 million times worldwide about injustice. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. But so there's an interest in the discussion of injustice and race, but we don't do it in a sustained way. How do we have that conversation in a real sustained way in this country?
I think it builds on what Sherilyn was just describing. So I listened to what she just said, and I want to say to the US government, and to particularly the United States military, you owe something to black veterans in this country that you have not paid. You owe something. My dad just died a couple of weeks ago. He was a veteran. He fought in the Korean War. He tried to build a house in 1958, cost $12,000. He was still paying for that house in 2017, still paying for it because he couldn't get the loans that his white comrades got when he came back from Korea. And there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just like him. And now I'm going to have to, with my siblings, deal with that debt. And I'll be honest, I'm angry at the United States military because they didn't do for black veterans what they should. Now, it begins with an understanding of what happened. And you know, we didn't get into the middle class. When I was, we were low income. I don't mind telling people we were poor. My parents told me we were low income but upper class, and I went with that. And I took it as far as I could go, which wasn't very far. But I think there is an institutional demand that we should be making. So we've been doing this work about the lynching and terrorism that black veterans confronted when they came back from World War II. Many of them were lynched and murdered just because they were wearing the uniform. We haven't talked about it. So I want to say to the US military, what should you do for this generation, generations of black veterans who you owe something to, who you have not paid? And I think we have to talk institutionally when we start thinking about it. Then I think we have to talk socioculturally. So the thing I'm fascinated with right now, so Alabama's Constitution still prohibits, I'm gonna say this slow because it's hard to hear and understand. Alabama's Constitution still prohibits black and white kids from going to school together. It is in the state constitution. And the only way you can get it out of the state constitution is to have a statewide referendum where people vote on whether to remove that segregation language out of the Constitution. We have tried twice now to get that language removed. In 2004, 52% of the people in the state voted to keep the language in the state constitution. In 2012, after the election of Barack Obama, the number went up to 63%. Now here's the bizarre thing. There is nothing in Alabama about which you can be legitimately proud, everybody, except our college football teams. Our college football teams are serious. Alabama, Auburn, they are no joke. They win. They've won a bunch of national championships, and it's probably the thing about which there is more enthusiasm, more community, more excitement than anything in that state. But I look at that team. They were in the national championship this year. It's a predominantly black team. In fact, at times it's an all-black team. You got all black people on. And if you said to those football players, what you're doing is unconstitutional, if you said to people in Alabama, you can't have that football team until you change this constitution, all of a sudden there's going to be a tension that nobody feels, right? And I think we have to create tension. That is the only way you do this work effectively. You've got to create that tension. I couldn't play for a team in a state where constitutionally I'm not supposed to be with white players. I couldn't do it.
And that's what I meant about the cost of racism
Absolutely.
to everybody.
Absolutely.
That's a cost.
Absolutely.
To
And
the pride of Alabama.
Absolutely.
You're right. Football is a religion. I'm from the South too.
I know you
But
know it.
have we ever calculated the benefit? I've been thinking about this, like what I call the equality dividend.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, I'm a business person, because I speak to all kinds of different groups, and I very often speak to extremely successful and wealthy people in the hopes that they will support us with some money.
I plan to talk to some of those folks, too.
I share my list. And I take great pride in speaking to these groups because I feel very confident that, for almost every room that I'm in of successful people, LDF had a role in making that room, just because of the work that we've done. So, but what I wonder is, have we been going about it the wrong way? Have we failed to calculate the money that gets made and has been made off of the reputation of a country that was created and constructed by civil rights activists?
Right.
What you could say about America in 1950 is very different than what you could say about America in 1955. You walk into a room in 1960, 1965, and you're a business person, and you carry with you this idea of America as a place of democracy, a place where the rule of law reigns, a place of equality, a place of opportunity. There is a kind of a moral, at least there was, a kind of a moral superiority, right, to being an American in many places in the world that has a tremendous benefit to this country. It allowed us in the Cold War to be who we were in the Cold War, and to, some would say, win it, right? But we've never calculated the equality dividend. It's like for free. We just made America look really good, right? Because the truth is, America was confronted with the most marginalized people in their society who stood up and said no more and confronted that inequality and did it without guns and did it without fists for the most part, and stood up and confronted the most powerful country in the world, and to its credit, the most powerful country in the world didn't kill them all. Didn't kill them all. Killed some, but didn't kill them all. And instead, made some effort to transform itself around, you know, the things that we think of as the pillars of the civil rights movement. If we're honest about it, that's true. And that's a source of pride in this country. So what's that worth? We just gave that away for free and make it like you did us a favor? We did America a favor by creating and constructing that identity, which is the identity people really are advancing when they talk about America as a place of equality and justice. It's an identity that we really helped construct.
Yeah, but one of the challenges is that when you are oppressed, when you're enslaved and you're finally emancipated, you don't feel like you have space to hold people accountable for your enslavement. When you're dealing with terrorism and lynching, you don't feel like you have space to hold people accountable for that terrorism. When we get into the civil rights era, at each period in our history, we have been struggling with some of these forces that are so overwhelming that even when we get on the other side of the force, we don't feel empowered to say, now wait a minute, let's talk honestly about what we've just been
I also
through.
think that we feel that having won the legal battle, we've won the overall war.
Right.
And the reality is, we did change a lot of laws. We changed a lot of laws, and you're right, people did it. If you think about what happened in the 50s and 60s in this country, you know, when we were all young, they did it by going to different places and sitting down. They sat down. And who would have ever thought that that could have literally changed this country and the world? But we thought that that was the war, and that was only the battle.
That's right.
Because those beliefs were still there. And the reality is that those beliefs do continue. And look, I you know, hold no answers to how we parse the human heart and get rid of racism, except to basically make it not worth anyone's while to engage in that. That's what that's what works
Loretta,
with people.
You've been talking about, you and I have been talking a little bit about how we now have those conversations at a local level.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's one thing to try to hold this government's feet to the fire. I think it's another thing to try to build a movement that reimagines democracy from the ground up. How do we do that? How do we work
Well,
in the
look,
local
I think people are beginning to recognize that we have to do that now. I mean, my predecessor, A.G. Holder, is working on a project that's going to focus on redistricting and looking at the issue of gerrymandering in this country and how that has not only suppressed a lot of voices, but how at the local level it can be dealt with and hopefully reversed. And that's the kind of individual local empowerment that has to happen. This all starts at the local level. It starts with somebody believing, I can run for a city council, and realizing that they can in fact not just win and be the black face on the city council, the female face, the LGBT face, but that they can actually get something done, and that they can in fact wield power. And so we have to focus on, I think, growing the next group of people who are going to join the political discourse and in fact wield that power at a local level. I think it's important because, look, we were blessed for 8 years. We had, you know, a wonderful president. I still say he will go down in history as one of our greatest presidents. I was tremendously proud to work for him. But politics is about more than who the president is. Law enforcement is about more than who the Attorney General is. So much more than that. What we were trying to do was to travel around the country and empower local voices, to highlight people who were dealing with these issues in communities at the grassroots level, at the ground level, and we were trying to lift their voices up, amplify them, and share them with the nation. Those voices are still out there, and those are the ones that we have to count on at this point in time, because you can in fact make change at a local level. You absolutely can. You know, I've spent several weeks in North Carolina recently, and they're trying to come up with a compromise to HB2. Whether they will or not, the fact that the economic boycotts have led that state to realize that it must change. And it's been at the city level, it's been discussed at city councils, it's been discussed not just in the State House, but also all throughout that state, is key. And we have to recognize that all politics is local, you know, as one of our great leaders said. And it all starts there. And if we want to rebuild to a point where we do have a federal government that is responsive to our needs and that does listen to people and that is based on inclusion as opposed to fear and exclusion, we have to populate it with people who hold those values dear, and we have to cultivate those people now. And I'm hoping that many of those people are the young people in this room tonight. That's what I'm hoping.
I appreciate that, because I also think, just to kind of move this to the law side, I just don't want to leave the law part out, because it's a critical component of this. I mean, because the truth is, we have a framework where the narrative ought to work for us, right? We talk about equality, we talk about rights, we talk about justice. We have all of that out there. These are guaranteed rights, but they don't get enforced. And so that's where the law part comes in. And I don't want anyone to think that that's not going to be a critical component of how we move forward. There was never a time in the county where I grew up where black children would have been permitted to go to public schools if it was left to a vote. The majority of people in that county were always going to vote for racial segregation. It took a court decision enforced by lawyers from the Legal Defense Fund coming into our community saying, no, you have to open up the public schools to kids like Bryan Stevenson. And but for that intervention, I wouldn't be here today. And that use of the law to push the society to confront its obligations is really key. We don't have marriage equality in this country because we won the narrative battle writ large. The narrative battle helped us get the court to do the right thing, but we won it because of a legal decision that now creates that option. And so we've actually got to be prepared to represent those local leaders when they step out and say, I'm going to do something.
Yes.
When those college football players say, I'm not going to play for this team if we don't do something about this. There's got to be some group prepared to stand up and support them. Dr. King and Rosa Parks were supported by lawyers who got them out of jail, who actually advanced their mission and vision. And that's where I also worry that we haven't created the kind of legal infrastructure that is prepared to do the push work, the narrative work that has to be done. Sherilyn got involved in a case 20, 30 years ago where there was an effort made to try to create remedies for the survivors of the Tulsa riots, right? This was this horrific racial violence that took place. And we've got survivors of racial violence all over this country. We've got survivors. You know, segregation wasn't just directions. Those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. People got injured by that. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. And we don't really have the extensive infrastructure we need to represent those people. And so I do think we're going to have to radicalize our sense of what it means to be a civil rights lawyer. You can't just be waiting until something really extreme happens in some foreign place. You've got to get in there and work with community groups and people who are trying to make a difference, have their back, as it were, and then be prepared to be smart, tactical, and strategic. And I want to emphasize that last word, because one of the problems we have when we start talking about race is that we don't always want to act strategically. And we don't win when we don't act strategically. And it's frustrating to act strategically because you don't get to say what you want when you want. You have to say it at the right time and in the right way. And that's painful at times. It's frustrating. But we need more strategic litigation to actually create the environment. What Sherilyn and LDF are doing in Texas is critical to whether we regain voting rights in this country. It's a strategic intervention in a state where there are critical needs. And I just think we've got too few lawyers, too few law institutions, too few people thinking about how we are going to become architects. That thing that Charles Hamilton Houston said to graduates from Howard Law School way back in the day, he used to tell his graduates, when you graduate from this law school, you're either a social engineer or you're a parasite. I don't think it's a crazy thing to be saying anymore. I really don't.
I want to ask Sherilyn and Loretta something. So Loretta was a great ally as we move forward on the civil rights front. Now we're not going to have those allies, it looks like, in the federal government. Who are your partners going to be, and how should we think of partners when we're pursuing this legal strategy?
Well, I think that, you know, I have to remind myself all the time that it was just 8 years that Obama was the president. And before that, the partnership was wasn't that great, you know? So I just think we shouldn't get it twisted, like we've had this unbroken line of standing shoulder to shoulder with the federal government. That really, not really.
The 8
not
years
so
might have
much.
been the gap.
Exactly. So that's helpful, and we have to kind of remind ourselves of that. When I was a young lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund, that was not the case. I think Ken Starr was the Solicitor General. I mean, it was like not great. So just to remind ourselves of our own power, you know, let's take policing reform. That's one of the areas in which, you know, I've been really the most exercised and agitated. And I have said to people that, you know, you have taken for granted what happened over the last 4 years. When the next conflagration happens, when the next uprising happens, there will not be Eric Holder flying to Ferguson to be in the coffee shop and shake people's hands. There will not be Loretta Lynch to fly to Baltimore and sit around a table with community leaders in the midst of the unrest. That's not going to happen. So what's going to happen? Right? And you know what Jeff Sessions is going to be saying. He's going to be talking about law and order, and they want the police officers to have all the military equipment, and you know, God knows what President Trump will be tweeting, and all of this is going to happen to fan the fires of the flame. So it's deeply problematic. And we're not going to have these pattern and practice investigations, but we should also remember that, again, under the Obama administration, pattern and practice investigations doubled. Before that, we didn't have a lot of pattern and practice investigations. What did we have? Well, think about one of the places that's really led on creating the narrative and moving forward the whole issue of policing reform. That's New York City. No pattern and practice investigation from the Justice Department, right? No federal intervention at all. How did it happen? A 10-year campaign that included strategic communications, organizing, an extraordinary group of activists on the ground, and litigation, right? Challenging stop and frisk. We filed one of the stop and frisk cases, the stop and frisk in public housing. And all of those came together in that case that went before Judge Scheinlin, that ended up with a consent decree that actually, you know, in many ways moved in de Blasio into office. It changed the whole dynamic. Look, let's be clear, 20 years ago, there was not the phrase stop and frisk. That was created through strategic communications around a campaign designed to address the issue of police brutality in New York. And it did not happen because we were in a partnership with the federal government. So I only say that to remind ourselves that we can do it. What it requires, first of all, that took an extraordinary amount of resources, a lot of time, and it took all of those elements. It took the litigation, it took organizing on the ground with activists, and it took an extraordinary communication strategy working in concert towards a common strategic goal. So that means that we can do it in other places as well. I would say when it comes to policing, you know, New York is as tough a nut to crack as any place. I don't regard, you know, Alabama, New York. New York's tough on this issue and has been at it for a very long time. So I think that to remind ourselves of that power is important. The only other thing I want to say is about local power, which Loretta began to refer to, and people running for office and so forth. When I was a lawyer at LDF as a young person, I remember we got a call to do a voting rights case in Galveston, which we ended up taking on. But when I first heard about the case, it was a case challenging the way justices of the peace and constables are elected. I'm a New Yorker. I thought that justices of the peace were the nice people who married you when you eloped, like I saw on TV. So I didn't understand why this was an issue and why people were so exercised about not being able to elect black justices of the peace, right? But it really took going into that community and learning the police power that justices of the peace have, the control they have over tickets, all the stuff you see in Ferguson and so forth, right? And understanding how important these local offices are. So one of the things we do at LDF is, although we do challenge, you know, the state of Texas's voter ID law and the state of Alabama's voter ID law, and no doubt we'll be involved in redistricting and so forth, a lot of the voting rights work we do is at the local level. We're going to trial in 2 weeks in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, challenging the way judges are elected there. It's really looking at the county commissions, the water boards, the school boards, the town council, the railroad commission, the sheriff. The sheriff evicts people. The sheriff. I mean, to really get down into the nitty-gritty of how political power is constructed and controlled in this country. And the problem with those of us who very often are in New York and are shiny and want to be civil rights lawyers is that we don't want to go to Etowah County, Alabama, and challenge the way county commissioners are elected. And I think that's part of the issue we have to talk about is geography. It's a big country. Y'all can't all be here in New York, and you can't all be in California.
That's right.
You have to be willing.
Yes.
It's really true. You have to be willing, you know, Brian can shut down any meeting. Brian and I serve on boards together, and people start talking about wonderful new innovations. He knows it's true. And they'll start telling us about what they did in Seattle and what they're doing in New York, and there's a new initiative in New Hampshire. And I'll look at Brian, I know he's getting ready to blow. It's gonna happen. And we just hear, and it sounds so wonderful, and this is what we did in San something County, California. And then Brian just, you know, lays the A-bomb, the Alabama bomb. Well, you know, what are you going to do in Alabama? Because at the end of the day, you know, this is what we've written off. They're all red states, and they're just down there. And if we can just get the blue ones in the middle. 52% of black people live in the South.
Right.
You are writing off most black people when you decide that you don't want to deal with the issues of the South. So
And you're missing opportunities to provide real power to
That's
real
right.
people
That's right.
in ways that affect lives very, very directly.
That's very immediately and very
the
directly.
School boards in most communities determine curriculum, they determine teacher tenure, they determine the makeup of the schools, they determine the school experience of children, all of our children.
The school board in
And-
Texas adopted that textbook that is being used all over the country.
Exactly.
That mistells lies about American history.
So
I
let
mean,
me talk to you all about education, since we brought that up. Brian brought it up. We've all talked about it. So I want to give you some numbers. What we've generally done is we've looked at different pathways out of inequality. We've looked at education as being one of the primary pathways. But recently, education's been a pipeline to the criminal justice system. I'm going to give you some numbers. This is from the U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Office. Black students accounted for 18% of the country's pre-K enrollment, but make up 40% of preschool's out-of-school suspensions. Black students in K through 12 were expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. Black girls were suspended at higher rates than any other girls and most boys. A quarter of the schools with the highest percentage of Black and Latino students did not offer Algebra 2. And 1 in 5 girls of color with disabilities received an out-of-school suspension. How are we going to begin to have a conversation about the disparate treatment of children of color?
See, I think it reflects the same problem that we've been talking about. I think, and I hate, when I go to colleges and give talks, it pains me to say it, but I have to say to every school I go to, I say to the kids of color, to students of color, I said, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how hardworking you are, how talented you are, how much kindness you have in your heart. If you're black or brown in this country, you will go places where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty. There is a presumption of danger and guilt that follows black and brown people. And it is most insidious for children because they show up with this presumption, and they don't know how to overcome a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. They're just 4 and 5 trying to live their lives. But we've allowed that presumption to manifest itself. And so I think we have to step back again and start asking bigger questions for me. So I think, you know, we have a lot of school districts where there are children that are in real stress. You know, you've got 200 zip codes in this country where 80% of the children are expected to go to jail or prison. I think that's a health crisis. I really do. I think the CDC should declare a state of emergency in those zip codes because we've got children born to families, violent families. They're living in violent neighborhoods. They're going to violent schools. And when they show up at 4 and 5, they have trauma disorders that we're not diagnosing, we're not treating. When you've got a trauma disorder, what you're trying to do, what you need to do is to make the child feel safe. We do the opposite. We threaten them. We make them go through metal detectors. We've got teachers that sound like correctional officers and principals who sound like wardens. And then we demonize those children. So I actually think we have to step back and say, who are these children and what do they need? What are in these communities and what do they need? And I think education, at this point in our history, for these really high-stress communities, has to partner with medical and with mental health because we've got a medical crisis in the communities where I sit down with 12 and 13-year-old boys who tell me that they don't expect to be free or alive by the time they are 25. And they're not saying that based on something they've seen on TV. That's what they're seeing.
It's their world.
It's their world.
It's their world.
And if we don't engage those children in a different way, we're not going to make them understand the things. We're not going to allow them to understand the things they need to allow. So I think we have to change some of the metrics. So I don't think the Department of Education should be giving high scores and awards and all of this stuff to these schools based on their test score performances. I think they need to make suspension and expulsion one of the metrics that we use to grade schools. And I think if you have a high suspension rate and a high expulsion rate, you are not a good school. And it doesn't matter. And just think, if we made that one of the primary metrics, then those schools are going to have to figure out, well, how do we help these kids,
opposed
these
to-
black girls and black boys and kids who are dealing with it. We're going to have to figure out, how do we keep them in school? How do we keep them from being suspended? How do we keep them from being expelled? And we haven't done that. And I don't think it would be that hard with the right leadership to persuade someone that's a real priority if we want to change
See,
things.
this is, Brian is just like spot on, and I think the thing that prevents us from doing that is we are caught in the grip of a kind of bizarre nostalgia. We really are, and I think we have to break ourselves out of it. I think it may be that this period that we're in right now with this administration will cure us forever, but a kind of nostalgia, right? So we want schools to go back to the way they were.
Yeah.
We want policing to go back to the way it was. No. We actually have to let public services meet the public, right? You define what are the parameters of good public service by the way in which that service serves the public, right? So when I hear people say, as teachers, I'm not a social worker, well, maybe now you kind of have to be a little bit of a social worker, right?
That's right.
Or we need to have social workers embedded in schools, right? So the school building, I'm fascinated and obsessed at this moment by thinking about the resources that exist within communities, right? Because resources don't just come from the sky, and so if we're going to build from the ground up, I need to know what's there. What do I know if I drive long enough, I'm going to run into it?
Right.
The school,
Right.
the police department, the library. I'm a big library person because it's just there. And how do we transform those institutions to become institutions that are truly responsive to the needs of those communities? When I was on the board of the library in Baltimore, one of the things that we did, after all these people are working on food desert issues in Baltimore, it's a terrible food desert problem, and we got tired of it, and so one of the things we did was that we created a food program in the library. You could order online, then you pick up the produce on Tuesday in your local branch, because we knew the library was in every community, right? So sure, we want to get a Giant, sure we want a Super Fresh, but until then, you could go to the library and get the produce. So in terms of the schools, part of what I think is the problem is these metrics that Brian is talking about, are these metrics that are supposed to get us back to some period when we think that school was really great, instead of transforming the schoolhouse to be a locus in the community that provides all the things that children need, that provides the counselors, that provides the social workers, that provides the physical activity, that provides the parent learning classes in the evening, that provides all the meals that you need, that provides the instruction, that provides all of those pieces in a kind of one-stop shopping. If that's what we need for the 21st century, to give those children a future, to educate them, to salvage their families, to give them a place of release from trauma. I'm the youngest of 10 kids. I loved school. I loved it. You just went to a place where it was just, you could just do your thing, and it was fantastic. School's supposed to be a refuge from the chaos of your home, not more chaos, right? So we should be creating that. And the reason I raised the policing thing is I think it's the same thing. When the president named that task force 21st Century Policing, the task force that Brian sat on, it's because there has to be 21st. What do police officers need to do now? What are the qualities that you need in a good police officer? Take down the picture of the SWAT helicopter and the black truck on the brochure, on the recruitment brochure, and what we need are people who are excellent communicators, right? People who know how to talk down a situation, people with intact egos, people who have, they're all, if you were going to really do it. But instead, we still think that we're going to harken back to some period when it was Officer Krepke, and that's not going to happen anymore. We need 21st century police. And so I think that's the problem with education that produces those statistics. It's them trying to literally muscle little black girls and boys into being who they're supposed to be based on this old image of what school is.
But one of the things that we have to do, though, is that as we bemoan the loss of the last 8 years, we can't forget the gains and lessons of the last 8 years, because a lot of what we're talking about got started, and it can be continued, it can be carried on, and it was very deliberately placed in communities, and it was very deliberately done to break down those silos and try and bring people together. On the issues of policing, it was community policing. It was engaging with officers who will say to you, on any given day, I am more of a social worker than a cop.
That's right.
And that's my job. And they actually love that job, that part of the job. trying to raise those officers up, as opposed to the ones who have themselves been traumatized and take it out on other people. Recognizing the trauma in law enforcement also is something that has to continue. And so I think we have to also think about and focus on continuing the empowerment of local communities and their voices in these issues. Local communities are still responsive. People have to demand better. They do. They have to ask for better, they have to demand better. They have to say, we deserve a school board that looks like us and elected. They have to say, we deserve a police department that knows our kids and understands who they are and works with us. And they have to demand it. And they have to go to City Hall and get it. And that kind of local empowerment, I think, is what we have to focus on. Frankly, I think it's a continual thing, but now more than ever.
Yeah.
But those lessons are there. And so I think we can look at the work that we did, and you're right, they're likely not going to be the pattern and practice cases that we saw over the last 8 years. But the lessons learned from those cases are tremendous. You know, communities now realize, you know, I have a say in how police get trained. I have a voice. I can use that voice. And so, but that is a constant drumbeat. Because one thing that does happen, it's not just that black and brown kids are told that you're dangerous and you're marginalized, they're also told you're stupid. They are. It doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter if you make it to the gifted or talented, it doesn't matter if you make it to Harvard.
Yep.
They are told you are intellectually less than the person sitting next to you. And so the lesson has to be, we have to counter that narrative within every child from day one, because that is also out there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the challenge for young lawyers and law students who are interacting with these populations, which you will do, because we're going to have, even if we have things go the way we are prescribing they go, there's going to be this transition period where young kids are going to be at risk, they're going to be threatened with jail and detention and all these things. I think it's important for us as advocates, for lawyers, for people who represent these children, these parents, these communities, to start giving voice to these realities. If you're a traumatized child and you go to school and people are just threatening you and you've never had a moment where you could actually live with some sense of freedom and self, and somebody gives you a drug at 8 years old and you use that drug and for the first 4 hours in your life you're feeling the absence of threat and menace, what are you going to want when that drug wears off? You're going to want more of that drug. And we're going to criminalize you for that. And when that child becomes 10 or 11 and when they're being threatened and menaced all the time, and somebody says, you know what, join my gang, man. We'll protect you. What we're going to do is actually punish you more because you made the same choice that everybody else would make if they were living that kind of life. But we haven't given voice to those choices. We haven't actually contextualized these lives. And then we allow legislators and other people beat up on these drug-addicted children and these young kids joining gangs in ways that I think is just completely incompatible with what it takes to actually move us forward. And that's partly all these big issues, but it's also partly these small issues, what we say and don't say, where we're standing up for people, when we're standing with people. And I couldn't agree more. When we were at Harvard, we did not have a ball, Sherrilyn, at the Harvard Law School. And that speaks to, I mean, you know, I shouldn't speak for Loretta and Tony, but I remember not wanting anybody to know when I was in law school that I started my education in a colored school. I didn't want people to know I was a great-grandson of enslaved people because I thought it might diminish me. And then I got to a point where I realized that that's actually not my weakness, that's my strength. And then I got to the point where I had to tell everybody. I started
And Brian did tell everybody.
But that transformation is rooted in understanding who we are and how we got to be where we are, and then giving voice to it. And I don't think we're doing that enough, even as lawyers representing clients coming from communities that are dealing with these issues.
So I want to say two things. One is, for the students and some of the young lawyers in the audience, we talked about children feeling inferior. But I know from the folks that come to my office, and I know from some of the lawyers that I talk to, sometimes in those firms and in law school classrooms you feel that way, and you need to resist it in the way that we're talking about. And so keep that in mind when you're sitting in that classroom at this institution as well, okay? So let me talk about, we talked about communities. We have we're in the midst of the largest migration in history back to cities, or at least in the last century and a half. It presents some profound problems about gentrification and segregation. How should we be thinking about developing our inner cities so we maintain some of the political power and we maintain some of the educational power that we're talking about? How do we face those challenges when we think of pure inequality in cities?
Well, I feel this quite keenly. I think it's quite important. It's very complicated, right? Because it raises a cluster of issues that we're increasingly internally at LDF talking about as a kind of a, little module around strengthening African American communities, to hold on to some of the ability to remain in cities and to be able to thrive. And the cluster of things, is about housing. And I want to leave education to the side because I really want to be talking about what is around the educational institution, what is around the school. So it's about housing, that's housing segregation, discrimination, and affordable housing, which is a huge problem in this country. It's about infrastructure, which includes both things like water, and we can talk about that, but also includes public transportation. And this is, again, a conversation that once you get out of New York and San Francisco, maybe you've got to start talking about what the lack of rapid transportation means for people. It creates debt. People have cars who shouldn't have cars. And this is just not something I really realized until I left New York and moved to Baltimore, the way all of these second-tier cities don't have this kind of transportation and don't have, therefore, the mobility. It's not, Johns Hopkins will hire you, in Baltimore. As a matter of fact, Johns Hopkins is one of the places that hires ex-offenders to their credit. But to get to Hopkins Bayview on the east side, if you live on the west side where Freddie Gray lived, it's going to take you an hour and 15 minutes on the bus, even though it's a 17-minute ride, right? Because there is no rapid transit that connects the African American community that lives east to west in Baltimore to the jobs and to that kind of mobility that allows them to move to different neighborhoods, that allows them to have access to the jobs and so forth. So the issue of public transportation is huge, and it bedevils me because you cannot do public transportation without serious federal dollars.
Right.
So you can talk local all you want, but unless you have all those good federal dollars, it doesn't happen. So there's the transportation issue, there's housing, there's the infrastructure water issue and all of kind of the environmental justice issues that go along with it. And then it really is about how do you allow people who live in communities already to hold on, right? We have a case right now challenging the tax foreclosure procedures in Detroit, right? Where just tens of thousands of people lose their homes in tax foreclosures, based on a tax system that basically overcharges poor people, using a formula that's prior to the 2008 housing crisis, and then people can't pay, and then if you want to challenge it, you have to show up to the office one day a month, only during business hours, all kinds of things. So just beginning to drill down and look at how do people lose their homes? How do people find that they can't live in the city anymore? How do we get people, I grew up in New York, and I've already said I'm the youngest of 10 kids. How did we make it? We made it because there was all of this public apparatus that allowed our family to make it and to survive. With that 135-cent token, I could have a job up in Harlem, which I did at some point, even though I lived in Queens, right? You could get around the city. You had City University of New York, and I think I told you this, I had a brother and a sister who both went. Registration was $85 a semester, and that was tough for us to get to 85, but you could do it, right? So there was this strong investment in public life. And one of the narratives that has been successfully advanced over the past 30 years is the privatization of almost everything in public life, whether it's prisons, universities, K through 12 schools. Everybody wants to sit in their car and drive. It's all taking us away from public life, which is the only way that you keep a strong middle class, the only way that people move from lower socioeconomic condition into the middle class, and the only way you maintain stability is if you have public institutions, public infrastructure, public services that are there to support your life and to support your family. So one of the narratives I hope that we will begin to attend to is to reclaim the word public. And the reason I think it's of a piece with what you're talking about, Brian, is because the word public only became dirty when it became associated with being black. Because public housing was built for white people initially. There was nothing about public transportation that was considered black, right? But the idea of public schools, when you think public schools, we talk about public schools, we know what we're talking about, right? So we took these things that were pillars of public life and American life and we racialized them. And then once we racialized them, we could demonize them and we could starve them of funds. And so now you can in Maryland get lots of money to build a highway, but you can't get money, but the governor cancels the plan to build the subway in Baltimore that's going to take people to the jobs, because that's public transportation. And when you say it in a speech in Maryland, all the people in the counties know what you mean
Yes.
when you say you're giving your tax dollars for public transportation in Baltimore, right? So reclaiming that narrative about public and private and detaching it from this demonized and kind of racialized context, I think is one of the most important narrative engagements we have to
This
undertake.
privatization narrative is actually old. It's been going on it's been going on since the Social Security Act was passed. And people have been trying to repeal that in one way or another ever since then. And what they always say is, let's privatize it in some
Yes,
way.
yes.
You know, let's turn that over to the marketplace.
market,
And you know, the marketplace is a wonderful thing, but it has crashed more than once, to the detriment of a whole number of people. And so the privatization debate and discussion has continued. And I do think that the one thing I want to throw out is that we have to learn from what has worked in terms of how narratives are constructed, how narratives are advanced, and how they eventually flip the discussion. Because they're very, very similar ways in terms of you start out small, and then it sounds innocuous at first. You know, private industry can do a great job at whatever it is, and they will be successful. And they only talk about success. It's not about the failures of so many businesses, which is part of life, is part of private life. And so, but in terms of how we construct a narrative on the success of public institutions, it's not necessarily a dissimilar path. You know, I don't think that we should not be afraid to take a page from the book of people who have done this successfully, and particularly in terms of communication strategy, in terms of narrative building, and in terms of shaping the discussion. Because there are things that work consistently for a reason, and we don't take advantage of them often enough.
I think there's something really powerful in what Sherilyn was saying about claiming the word public as one of the words that becomes incorporated in this move, this demand for racial equity and racial justice, because without kind of a really strong infrastructure and public services, the poor, all poor people are going to be disfavored and disadvantaged. And I actually think it is a way of even building some connections that we've needed to build for a long time across groups, between
Because you
groups.
said all poor people.
All poor people,
Yes.
that's exactly right. You know, when I tell people about the criminal justice system, and I have clients come to me, and you know, I put this in my speeches, I say, you know, our criminal justice system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. White poor people understand that just as clearly as black poor people. They have seen their loved ones be wrongly accused or unfairly treated, and they then begin to understand that they need public defense to help them, shield them from these kinds of threats. But I think we haven't talked enough about that public-private divide and the way it threatens the very movement and the very narrative that you're describing that is key to how we move forward. And I think it's a really helpful frame as we start building this narrative conversation around what we need.
I want to talk for a minute about immigration. So I'm from a small community in Northern California. It's primarily Latino and African American, and the community's in terror right now. And what we're seeing is this demonization of Muslims and Mexicans, people of color generally, is an old song to many of us. What are the lessons that we can learn and teach from the failures and successes of the civil rights movement now when we see the kinds of executive orders that are coming out of the White House?
Well, the fact that they're executive orders is very interesting.
Yeah.
And you know, this has been actually incredibly, you know, painful, I think, for many people in the country to watch this rending of families and this branding of people in all kinds of ways. The good side of it for me has been, of course, watching the role of lawyers in this and watching lawyers come to the fore and watching lawyers be celebrated. You know, people say to me all the time, ACLU's getting all that money, aren't you upset? I said, listen, when people think lawyers are heroes, I'm good, you know. It's fantastic. So that's been great to see. In some ways, I think it's forcing an important conversation that we need to have, because a lot of people have trafficked on the low in some immigration bashing, including people in our own communities,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
and so it's really pushed to the fore a conversation that needs to happen in churches and so forth about really who do we want to be vis-a-vis people who seek to enter this country. Yeah. If we get this conversation right, we will engage the unspoken issue about the role that we play in conditions that happen in other countries that make people even feel like they want to come here. Because I do think that, you know, for us, one of the things when this election happened and, you know, there was a little bit of trauma and we had some conversations and some drinks, and then we said, you know, we have to get to work. One of the things that we talked about is we talked about the areas that we knew would be affected. We knew that we would not have the Justice Department as a colleague on voting rights. We knew, you know, policing reform. We knew on our desegregation cases in the South. We knew all that. One of the things we wanted to be careful about was to make sure that we left bandwidth to engage in issues that are not the primary issues that we deal with, but that we knew would be under attack, because we said this is a moment when there can be no daylight between us and any groups that are under attack. So it's one of the reasons why we immediately started to figure out what did we want to do in the immigration space, and I reached out to the National Council of La Raza and Janet Murgia, and so we've been focusing on the ICE raids, and particularly because we think the ICE raids are very much connected to the whole issue of policing, since they're all this deputizing of police departments, and really trying to come together to kind of cloak all these issues, even with our brand. We just, you know, finished our brief today on the transgender bathroom issue, our amicus brief on the transgender bathroom issue. Just making sure that we have enough bandwidth in the organization that we're forming a seamless wall. We don't pretend that immigration is our expertise, right? But you know what? We said we got to learn something. We got to get up to speed, you know, and we have to figure out how we can contribute something. We're not going to be better than groups that already do it, but we should figure out what out of LDF's brand can we contribute to addressing that issue. So that's the space in which we're trying to operate. And I really recommend and have been recommending, and I have to say it's been quite extraordinary since the election to see, you know, whether it's Planned Parenthood, ACLU, Lawyers Committee, how we really have all stood together. There have been a number of collective meetings about what this moment means, about how we want to deal with the Supreme Court, about the threats that our organizations may be under. I mean, it's really been quite encouraging to see this kind of connection. And so that's been our kind of approach, is that we try to leave a little bit so that there's at least a part of every one of these issues that we're kind of bringing into our orbit, and making sure that we play a role in it.
And that, I think, is the difference that will sustain these movements, because when you phrase, and I'm glad you phrased the question that way, what can we learn from the civil rights movement and maybe some of the missed opportunities there, I think it was being so focused on the immediate issues of the pain of people of color in this country that we were not able to connect them to the pain of other groups in this country. And it's interesting to me that I shouldn't say every, but many of our civil rights leaders had begun to do that when they were cut down. That's where Malcolm was going when he was cut down, when he was assassinated. He was broadening the appeal of the human rights agenda of the Nation of Islam when he lost his life. That's where Martin Luther King Jr. was going too. And people opposed him speaking out on the war in Vietnam. They opposed him speaking out on purely issues of poverty. And so I do think that those were missed opportunities. Again, in part because those leaders left us, but also because we were so focused on the immediate and very painful issues of the day facing Black people that we did not continue that step and connect it to the issues facing everyone in this country. Because the narrative now is, and I like how you phrase it, we're going to go back to this great time in the 50s when things were great for a certain group of people. But if you look at all the disparate groups that now think that they are going to rise to the top with this narrative, they have as many issues as anybody else. They may be expressed differently. They may come at us in a different way, but the economic issues facing poor people, you know, face poor people of color and people who are living in poverty in Appalachia, in deep pockets of the South. You know, life is as hard for poor whites as it is for poor Blacks. And so we don't bring those groups together. We have let the narrative of racial differences sort of supersede that and separate those discussions. And I think when it comes to immigration, we have an opportunity and a challenge to see this as something that represents something that could happen to any group, to any one of us, could be demonized in some way, whether it's where we're from, our religion. We've seen it in other areas as well. And as soon as someone becomes the other, support drops away, or it becomes sort of vocal and not what you're talking about, Sherilyn, the real support. And that's where I think we have to go, because if we continue to remain fractured, not because, again, of antipathy, but because we're so focused, we live in our own heads, we live in our own worlds, and we face our own issues. But to me, the message of the civil rights movement has always been, these are everyone's issues. All of us are different. All of us can and have been marginalized at some time. And I think the issue with immigration is challenging because it's really an economic issue. If you listen to the debate, it is phrased in terms of safety and economics. Immigrants are going to make our country less safe, make our communities less safe, make people in the streets less safe, or they're taking jobs away from Americans. And no one is really drilling down on either of those. We have the facts to dispute all of that, and we don't use that in the dialogue and the debate.
I have to say, because I'm a student of LDF history, and one of the things I love is to mine what I think are just some of the things that people don't realize about that history that goes directly to this point. I talk all the time about the fact that LDF in 1971 won the first sex discrimination and employment case in the United States Supreme Court. And we won that case on behalf of a white woman named Ida Phillips, who had applied for a job at Martin Marietta. It was the company policy that they did not hire women who had preschool-age children, because they should be home taking care of their kids. And so when her case was in the Supreme Court, we briefed and argued the case for her, and we won that case, right? So I think, people think about civil rights being like somewhere over here that these black people are doing. And what I always want people to understand is that the equality principle actually is unifying and essential to unite us all, right? So Ida Phillips is a white woman, but, and probably many people sitting here don't know that it was the Legal Defense Fund that litigated the case that broke this ability of corporate employers to be able to say, we won't hire women with preschool-age children. In the same way that, LDF had these strange situations where we would represent people for principles because we understood the otherness. Both of the times we represented Muhammad Ali, for example. We represented Muhammad Ali to get his boxing license back in New York State, and we represented him in the Supreme Court when his draft conviction was thrown out. And it really was about drilling down and understanding what was the threat that was constituted by Muhammad Ali to the powers that be. And we understood exactly what that threat was, and we understood how it went to this core narrative that Brian is talking about, and how it was relevant to all the other clients that we had in that work. So being able to see beyond, as you say, the kind of traditional case that's right in front of you is the voting rights case, it's the school board, it's the right, and being able to make the connections to the way in which oppression works similarly across different boundaries really can allow you to do your finest work and confuses the enemy. It really confuses the other side, which is great.
But I also think there's something really helpful in understanding, kind of just how we think about group identity and even personal identity. I've always marveled at the fact that when people think there's some advantage to be gained, they are willing to adopt somebody else's identity. Oh, wait, you mean if I'm like 1/1000th Native American, I can have a better chance at, well, that's what I am. And in certain sectors where you think that some group is advantaged, then you want to be. That's not the way this should work. It's actually when groups are being targeted and menaced and threatened and excluded that we all need to get together and say, you know what, we're all Mexican. We're all Muslim. We're all the people who are doing this. And I think one of the lessons from the civil rights movement is that when people who were not African Americans stood with African Americans, when they were getting beat at sit-in counters, when they were getting beat on the march from Selma to Montgomery, those were the people who were really the allies. Standing after the law has passed, when you're at the White House signing something, that's not so meaningful. But when you're there, engaged in struggle, where people are literally trying to kill you, that's when it matters. And people lost their lives. And that's the time when you need to actually stand up and say, you know what, I'm going to be with that group.
And we need to make it an American problem.
It is an American problem. It needs to be a
collective American problem. So let me tell you, we have this talk tonight. My mind keeps going to strategy. We have tended to be so reactive. I want to ask all three of you a question. I'm just going to start and work my way around. But if we think about the one or two most significant weight-bearing walls when we think about race and inequality in the law, if we were to somehow find a way to knock them down and make progress, what would they be for you? What would be the one or two things that you think would be significant as we move forward in a strategy? Sherilyn, let me start with you.
Well, I don't have all the answers, obviously. I mean, I think I'll say something really sexy. So I'm not going to go top line like changing how people feel about, we all won, and I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say that my own view is that you change what you can change. And one of the ways that change can happen in this country, and we've already talked about this, is by understanding where dollars go and controlling the money. And we have a very nice and tidy civil rights statute that is supposed to compel us to watch where the money goes. And that civil rights statute is the principal reason why people like me who grew up in New York got bused to an integrated school, and why integration, to the extent it happened for a brief period, happened at all in the North. And that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in addition to outlawing segregation in public accommodations and other things, states that the federal government may not provide funds to any program that engages in discrimination. And it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and that prohibition that made northern schools begin to desegregate because they thought they were going to get the money cut off from the Department of Education. And in a very rare cases, money was cut off, but the threat of it was really enough. And I'm a big fan of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think it is the most underutilized, Title VI is the most underutilized portion of the statute. Now, we used to have a private right of action under Title VI, so I could actually sue until 1997 in a case called Alexander versus Sandoval, when the Supreme Court decided that there is not a private right of action. So if legislatively we could get that private right of action back, it would be game-changing. However, even if we don't get it back, the federal government is supposed to itself, in all of its programs, make an assessment that it is not giving money to programs that discriminate. And so Attorney General Lynch knows that this was one of our principal points on policing. We give $2 billion a year to police departments. I never said cut off the money. In fact, I said give them more money if you can, if they can prove that they're not engaged in discrimination. Well, how do we do that? That means we have to have the data collection. That means I need to know about diversity. That means I need to know about what kind of training you're doing to use Title VI as a window, as a means. All of the ways that we challenge the school discipline disparities that you're talking about are Title VI complaints that we file with the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. That would be the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education that the new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, says she wants to get under control. That office is the office that when we discovered that in Brazos County that the Bryan Independent School District was issuing Class C misdemeanor tickets to high school students for swearing, with a disproportionate effect on Black and Latino children, we could file that OCR complaint with the Department of Education and trigger an investigation because of Title VI, because you cannot be giving money to that school district if they're engaged in discrimination, and so you have to do that investigation. I think Title VI is underutilized. It requires a lot of our resources, because to put together a Title VI complaint is as good as putting together a complaint as though you were going to litigate. Then it requires staying on top of the particular agency or the particular federal agency, and it's really hard, even when they're trying. Even the last 8 years when they were trying, it's getting the regional offices, it's getting the right training, it's knowing what metrics to use, but it is gold if we could just polish it and reveal it and use it.
So Brian, what would be your weight-bearing wall or walls?
Well, I mean, it's sort of funny. I mean, we're doing this cultural work, and I think it's really, for me, it's been very energizing because, I went to South Africa, and what I experienced there was that people insisted on making sure I understood the damage that was done by apartheid. When I talk to Rwandans, you can't spend time in Rwanda without them telling you about all of the damage done by the genocide. I go to Berlin. You can't go 100 meters without seeing those markers and monuments that have been placed near the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. And then I come to this country, and we don't talk about slavery, we don't talk about lynching, we don't talk about segregation. And so our project is really trying to create a new landscape. We're building a museum. I never thought during my law practice that I'd be spending so much time working on a museum, but our museum is called From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. We have to get people to understand the damage that was done to this country with this legacy. So we kidnapped 12 million Africans, kidnapped them, brought them across the ocean in this torturous journey, killed millions of them, held them in captivity for centuries, and we haven't acted as if we did anything wrong. And if we don't begin to increase a consciousness of wrongdoing, lynching over 4,000 people, taking black people out of their homes, burning them alive, hanging them from trees, brutalizing them, making them, one of the largest mass migrations in the history of the world was the mass migration that took place when 6 million black people fled the American South for the North and West as refugees and exiles from terror. And then that segregation, saying to black children every day, you can't go to school because you're black. You can't vote because you're black. And we haven't really developed any shame about this history. So what I want to do is I want to increase the shame index of America. I do. I do. Because we do a lot of things great. We do sports, we do all that kind of stuff, but we don't do mistake very well. We don't apologize very well. And if you don't learn to be shameful about shameful misbehavior, you'll keep doing that behavior over and over again. And I think we've got to do more to get us. I think if you say, I'm sorry, it doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong. If you show me two people who've been in love for 50 years, I'll show you two people who've learned how to apologize to one another when they get in trouble. And I think we have to create that cultural moment where it becomes okay. And part of the reason why we don't want to talk about this history is we've become such a punitive society. Most people think, well, if we talk about slavery, if we talk about lynching, if we talk about segregation, somebody's going to have to get punished. And I just want to say to people, I don't have any interest in punishing America for its past. I represent people who've done really terrible things. I'm not interested in prioritizing punishment. I want to liberate us. I want to get to the point where we can say that was bad and that was wrong, and we need to get to someplace that's better. I want to deal with this smog created by our history of racial inequality so we can all breathe something healthy, feel something healthy. And so for me, the big barrier is to kind of create a cultural moment where we start talking about this history, where we start putting up markers at every lynching site, where we start reclaiming the narrative around what happened during that era of segregation, when we start talking about slavery spots in New York City that haven't been acknowledged and recognized. And I think if we do that, then maybe we can get to the point, I want people when they come to our museum to go through it. When I go to the Holocaust Museum, I walk through it and I come out and I'm shaken. And what I say is never again. And we need to create places in this country where you come and you have an experience with the history of slavery and lynching and segregation. When you come out, you say never again. And if we get enough people in this country to say never again to this history of racism and bigotry, we won't be facing some of the problems we're facing right now.
Loretta?
So, I think building on what Brian said, and also echoing Sherilyn, Brian would start sort of at the beginning of the root of so many of the causes of the problems that we have here, which is how we see each other. But looking at what we actually can change, the load-bearing wall for me, I think, would be, I would still continue to push for significant criminal justice reform. I think that, I've been a prosecutor for over 20 years, and, what you prosecute and how you prosecute defines you as a society. It tells communities, it tells families, it tells the world whom you value, what you value. It tells people what their status is. Are you a victim or are you the perpetrator? I've had cases where I've had people who could be either one on any given day. And so how we handle people who are caught up, as my grandfather used to say, in the clutches of the law, I think really reveals a lot about who we are as a society. And like Brian too, the stories about your family that we used to never tell, and now I tell everyone. My grandfather was a sharecropper and a minister. He had 8 children and a 3rd grade education, and he had built a church next to his house. And what he used to do was when black people in his rural North Carolina community got in trouble, they would come to him and he would hide them from the sheriff, who knew him and who probably knew what he was doing. And my grandfather was a righteous man, he was a moral man, he was a man of conviction in God, but for him this was a bigger issue because he knew that if there was no fairness in how people were treated, then there was no justice for anybody in that community. And so I think when I look at our criminal justice system and the years that I've spent working in it, because I do believe that it exists to protect people, and I was very proud to be able to protect many communities who never had anyone to protect them. But looking at the way in which we choose how we punish and whom we punish is fundamental to who we are. And I still actually have a sliver of hope, because again, I think by enlarging that debate, and having people see the human cost, the moral cost, the cost to race relations in this country, but also the cost, the economic cost, which translates into other kinds of harm. You know, the things that we could be doing and could be investing in, other than locking up people who are not necessarily the problem. And I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who are. Look, I have a very realistic view of human behavior and what we need to do to hold people accountable. But layering on the things that we have layered onto it, you know, adding those issues of fear, you know, I'm afraid of you, and so therefore it's much more likely that I'm going to lock you up. And see, when you lock people up in this country, they're still forgotten. And that's something, I think the reason we were able to get to a point where we almost succeeded was because we've now locked up so many people from so many backgrounds. You know, I think what was the number now is like 1 out of every 4 Americans has been touched by the criminal justice system in their life. If not that person, then a family member or a friend. And so now everyone is seeing how it can drag you down and keep you from living up to your full potential. And so we were able to get a cross-section of people who, for a variety of reasons, realized we had to focus on being more effective and more efficient and more fair.
So let me ask you guys one last question each, and that is that I want you to speak to my kids in the audience. So what happened after the election and what's happened in recent weeks with the uptick in religious and racial violence is that a lot of my kids have lost hope. Not to give away any of our ages, although Brian tried to. We've been through this before. Sherilyn swears she wasn't born during that time, but we've been through this before. How do you keep a sense of hope and optimism, given what's happened and what we've seen? Sherilyn, let me start with you.
So this is going to sound, has nothing to do with the law, okay?
It's all right.
You know, at least initially. You know, I talked about this just in my church yesterday, actually. You know, about remembering, about how much power we get from remembering. And my own view is that we have very, very short memories, and we really need to engage an understanding of the people who came before us and what they actually had to overcome. Yeah. And I'm not even just talking about black people, because really, the world has come apart time and again, you know, over the hundreds of years. And if you're sitting in this room, it means you come from a line of people who were able to survive whatever they had to survive at some point. I mean, you weren't always, you know, this wealthy and look this good and smart, and you know, somebody somewhere in your line had to overcome poverty or war or famine or devastation or terrible health or injustice. And I think that our disconnection from those stories, our disconnection from understanding that history, this goes to Brian's point, is so deep that we sometimes think we can't survive what we can't survive. So I talked about a woman in my church who, just because I was interviewing her, she was at the time 85, I think, and I was asking her, because I was writing this lynching book, and I realized that she had been alive when there was a trial of someone who was accused of murder, who was almost lynched in this town in Maryland. And we were talking about something else, and she just said, well, I was the first black poll worker in this town. And she described how she was the first black poll worker when she was 16. Because her father wanted the polls watched, he and his male colleagues, African Americans in the community, but knew that if they went into the poll place, it would be seen as threatening. So he thought that she, 16 years old, and her friend were smart enough that they could do it, and he got them a bag lunch, and they went in and they observed the polls all day. So I was talking to Ms. Valerie, and it was so inspiring to me, because here we were, wringing our hands. Can we challenge voter ID? What are we gonna do? You know, and this 16-year-old girl, you know, was a poll watcher in the 1940s. And I think just connecting ourselves to those struggles and understanding some of the struggles will make you say never again. Some of the struggles will expose you to the realities of human nature that we really have to beware of. We can't have magical thinking. But some of it tells us about the power. I talk about Thurgood Marshall and challenging segregation at University of Oklahoma Law School, the Sipplewell versus Fisher case. First day of trial, you know, he and Ada Sipplewell, who's the African-American woman who's applied to University of Oklahoma Law School or sitting at counsel table and he's trying the case and so forth. Well, it had never occurred to them that they could not eat in the cafeteria of the courthouse. So at the end of the day, he laughs and he says, well, tomorrow, I'll try the case and you bring the bologna sandwiches. Ha, 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 nice, very lighthearted. And I love it because that's Thurgood. He always wore it very lightly, right? Because I would march on Washington because I want to eat, in the cafeteria. But he always wore it lightly, and I try to remember that and try to do it myself. But it also tells you something about what it means to have your eyes on the prize and to be able to see something that doesn't exist for you. So he cannot eat in the cafeteria, but he is trying this case that ends up in the Supreme Court, which he wins, challenging segregation at University of Oklahoma. And it tells you something about how you have to have your eyes further at the horizon rather than just what's in front of you. So these are difficult times. One of the things I'm very much against is people pretending that we're not in trouble. We are in trouble in this country. I think we're going to make it, but it's going to require us really being serious about the moment that we're in and being serious about how we're going to get ourselves out of it. I know we can do it because of what's happened in the past. And we have to kind of draw on that. We have to draw on that history. We have to draw on that determination. We have to draw on that strength. I mean, I just told you about Ida Phillips. Why would this woman take this case to the Supreme Court? I find her so fascinating, who wants to work at Martin Marietta. This is the kind of determination that people were able to show. This is the determination that I see in my clients all the time. So my hope really comes from them, from people who, why would they do it? Why not just go along to get along? But they don't. They say, I'm willing to sign on the line. They're Barbara Johns, who walked out of Moton High School in 1951 in Prince Edward County and really forced LDF to file the Virginia Brown case before we were ready. Her principal said, don't do it, don't walk out, don't create this problem. And she said, I have to do it. And she just had a building dedicated to her in Virginia by Governor McCullough last week. 16-year-old girl. So it's those people, if you're channeling them, then you have to be hopeful and you have to be optimistic.
Right, yeah.
Professor Stevenson.
Again, well, no, I think Sherlyn said it. We have to actually understand who we are in this struggle, in this story. I mean, I get overwhelmed a lot of times. We've had a lot of tough days doing what I do. Just came here today and state seeking another execution date. And every now and then I go into the front part of the office and I look out the window and I think about the people who are trying to do what I'm doing, who were doing it 60 years ago. And what they had to say frequently is, my head is bloody but not bowed. I've never had to say that. And it just tells me I don't get to complain. This is probably not the best way to say it, but you don't have the choice of being hopeless. It's just not even a debate you should be having with yourself. You don't get to be hopeless and then call yourself somebody trying to do justice. You just don't. You really don't. And that's what Thurgood Marshall understood. He understood, I can't be hopeless and worry about that. I've got to keep, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. When you are fighting for justice, you are fighting against hopelessness. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And so you have to see hopelessness as a kind of toxin that will kill your ability to make a difference. And the truth is, you're either hopeful, working toward justice, or you're the problem. There's nothing in between. There really isn't. You can't be neutral and say, well, I'm just not going to be. No, you're part of the problem. And so I absolutely believe it is looking back and understanding that you're standing on the shoulders of people. I really do think that sometimes when you feel like you're worried and you're not sure you can do something, push yourself. Be the person who stands up when everybody else says sit down. Be the person who speaks when everybody else says be quiet. And you'll find a power in being that voice, and being that light, and being that representative that will make it clear to you that you can do so much more than you think you can do. And so I couldn't agree more with what Sherlyn said. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. I tell this story a lot. When I was a little boy, my grandmother used to squeeze me so tight, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then I would see her an hour later, and my grandmother would turn to me and she'd say, Brian, do you still feel me hugging you? And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, she had taught me and all of her other grandchildren, as soon as we would see our grandmother, the first thing we would say is, Mama, I'll always feel you hugging me. And she had this way of creating a relationship to you that you would never end. When my grandmother was in her 90s, she was still working as a domestic. She fell on a bus. She broke her hip. She developed cancer. She was dying. I went to see her. And I was holding her hand. Last time I was going to see her, I knew she was going to pass away soon. And I thought she was asleep. I thought she wasn't listening. And I was sitting there just holding her hands. And I said something to her. Then I said goodbye. And then she squeezed my hand. The last thing my grandmother said to me, she said, do you still feel me hugging you? And there are times right now, in the midst of a lot of conflict and controversy, well, I will feel that extraordinary black woman who wrapped me up in her arms, hugging me. And it's through that kind of strength, through that kind of witness, I do not have the choice of becoming hopeless. And I believe if she could fight the way she fought, I've got to fight even harder and even better. That's what I do for her.
Madam Attorney General.
So I think, you know, I could obviously echo those sentiments all night, but I think also the challenge that I hear you raising is as we talk to particularly young people today, our college students, our law students, people who are starting out and who for the last 8 years have really seen the best of America, or they've seen America rise to a better place. I don't want to imply that we were finished. And now it sort of feels not just a reversal, but literally going backwards to a time that a lot of them really can't really fathom, you know, can't really focus on because it's not their world, it's not their reality. And I know that the reason why it is so important to raise up our history is because if you don't, it just becomes a story. You know, you don't understand what it means, and you don't understand that Brian's grandmother, you know, the daughter of slaves, probably in her world was just a working woman holding her family together, but instead was an inspirational figure. You know, or the plaintiffs that went to LDF way back, we're talking in the 40s and 50s, viewed themselves as average, ordinary people who didn't really have anything special about them, but have become very special. And so that's why history is important. But going forward, you know, what I say to young people, particularly when they raise this issue, is these are difficult times. And you're going to see some things and hear some things that are going to shock you, they're going to stun you, and they're going to scare you. And maybe you've seen them already. They're going to make you wonder, what has America chosen and why? They're going to make you wonder, can we survive all of this? And all that will happen. But they will also make you look at yourself in a way you never thought possible. They will make you figure out what's important to you, whether it's an issue, whether it's a cause, whether it's a personal concern. They will highlight that for you. The times that we are in and are about to transition through will highlight for you what's important to you in ways that you aren't going to see right now. And you will find the issue or the cause that touches you. And you'll find the issue that's most meaningful to you, whether it's immigrant rights, you know, whether it's human rights in general, whether it is criminal justice reform, whether it's being a civil rights lawyer, whether it's politics. It'll come to you. And it'll come to you in ways that you can't imagine right now. And so that's what's going to happen to all of you. And it's going to be painful to get there, but it always has been. This is hard work. It has always been hard work, but it is the best work that you will ever do. The work of bending your shoulder and making this world a little bit better. In whatever way comes to you, it is the best thing you will ever do. It'll make you the best person you will ever be. And so that's what I see ahead for young people today. That's my hope.
Let me say one thing, particularly to my students in the room, and that is what I see as hopeful is that when I was in law school and I looked next to me, these are the people that I saw. Look next to yourselves. You see the next Loretta Lynch, the next Bryan Stevenson, the next Sherrilyn Ifill. I've been really proud of how you have responded and how you will continue to respond. I'm proud of this institution, and I'm proud of the folks who are part of it. Join me in thanking my folks here.